How to know your audience while promoting architectural work. Hi, my name is Marcin Wojciech-Żebrowski and welcome to Urbcast, my podcast about architecture, urbanism and many more. I'm very happy to share with you the newest episode of the Communications and Business Development series of my podcast. In this series, I'm meeting with professionals working within business development and PR in architecture offices in Denmark, but also in other countries. And today I am extremely happy to present the newest conversation with Josefine Lykke, who is the CEO at JAJA Architects. She's also a trained architect and communications consultant. I think that Josefine has very vast experience in especially the promotion of architectural work. She was graduated as an architect, but very early on she started being interested in this promotional and journalism side of architecture. So in our conversation, we wonder about how to skillfully present your work and how to get to know the audience that you are communicating with. I hope that you will enjoy our discussion. Josefine, thank you very much for coming to Urbcast. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here.
I'm very happy that you invited me here to JAJA's office. It's very nice to have this conversation, especially that we are talking in the model shop.
Right. So we're a bit out of space this morning. We have a lot of meetings, so our meeting rooms were totally booked. But I thought maybe we could improvise and do a standing session here, and it seems to be working really well.
I think that in architecture, in planning, you need to improvise sometimes, right?
Definitely. I think that is a very important competence to have, yeah.
So I think that this is just something that we can elaborate on later in our conversation. And today I would like to talk about PR and communication in architecture, but also we'll probably talk a bit about business development and also other tasks, as you are now the CEO of JAJA Architects. And I think that this position combines many different aspects. And before we jump into that, can you please introduce yourself?
Sure. So as you said, my name is Josefine. I'm a trained architect. I went to the Aarhus School of Architecture and I did my bachelor's before I went to do my first internship. And quite soon after that, I realized that I was much more into writing and communicating architecture than to actually designing and drawing myself. So I turned my education into specializing more into that field. And then I guess the rest is history, sort of. That's what I've been doing for the past 10 years almost. Talking about architecture, communications, PR. So moving slightly more into the business development part.
I'm especially happy that we can talk, and I hope that you will share some experience, maybe some advice as well, because I have also some young architects, young professionals contacting me, and some of them I think might have some kind of a similar situation as you had. So they are in architecture, but they are looking for something else.
Right.
They are just looking for some other possibilities, maybe still within architecture. But why not on this more promotional side? Mm-hmm. And here comes the PR and journalism. And this is something that you diverted your career and attention still while studying, right? So what was your first inspiration, your motive for this change?
So I always loved writing, right? Back in school, like the small kindergarten class or whatever, I was writing small short stories, novels, whatever. And I was always told that I was super good at it too, right? So it was a huge motivation for me to keep doing that. And then when I was looking for higher education, searching for fields to study, I was pretty clear, or I knew within my heart that I wanted to do something creative or something with communications. And so I visited the School of Journalism and I visited the architecture school. And I lost my heart to architecture, mainly due to the vibe of the school and the people there, but also due to the purpose, that architecture affects everyday life of every people, all the time. It's just this has this major impact on our life, right? So that's why I chose architecture over journalism at that point in my life. But then after only, like I said, 3 or 4 years, I changed the direction a bit back again. And I had this exchange course to the School of Journalism. And I kind of combined the both.
I wanted to say at the beginning that it was almost 180 turn, but maybe it wasn't actually, because as I hope, show in our conversation, PR and architecture can go hand in hand. I was just wondering, what tools did you have to kind of maybe not switch, but like educate yourself more towards journalism? Did you start with some school, maybe with some courses, or was it just like this natural talent that you kind of developed?
So it was kind of both, actually, because I obviously had this natural talent and this natural interest in writing. So when I did my first internship as a landscape architect, like as a landscape design architect, I was very quickly tossed into writing, updating the website. It was kind of a small company, no one to take care of those things besides from me. And I think my boss at that time, she quickly realized that I had a potential there, and I also had an interest in it. So I also, updated business development material, our reference sheets, all that stuff. So I already started writing about architecture during my studies at architecture school. Then I took on a role as a blogger. That was back in the days where it was like huge to be blogging about. There was this student community blog in Aarhus where students from all the different educations blogged about their topic, right?
Okay.
But mainly about cultural and creative studies. And so I was like blogging about architecture in Aarhus. So I also kind of developed this practical, like everyday writing a little here and there, and, deadlines, keeping up with publishing rates and stuff like that. And then after doing all of this kind of training, hands-on training, I realized that I also wanted to build on with like more education. And I made it happen so that I could go to the School of Journalism and do my 7th or 8th semester. I don't remember, 9th maybe.
I'm honored to talk to one of the trendsetters if it comes to blogging culture.
I don't know but it was kind of, we're like kind of first movers. I remember that I was, some of my huge, like my idols back in the student environment in Aarhus were like, the ones that were blogging and telling about the things that they were good at. And but it was before, I think we were on Facebook, most of us, but it was definitely before Instagram. It was before lots of the other social media. So, I mean, we had the blog, the internet, the World Wide Web.
I don't want to say it was old school way, but kind of.
Super old school. I mean, no one does it today, but it was, but it worked back then.
So communication side was always there. I see that it was very present in your roots, in your early career as well. So how did you decide to connect those two, to still be working in architecture, but on this more promotional side of it?
I think I quickly realized that there was a huge demand for someone who could bridge the gap between architecture, designing, being creative, creating, and then the more business side of architecture, which I see PR and communication as it plays an important role in running an architecture, like a professional modern architectural business, right? Actually, I also think that there was a huge demand found a huge demand for me writing about architecture. I mean, this blog thing was obviously something I did kind of more, and because I wanted to build up my written portfolio also, right? And to gain some experience. But soon when I started looking for people who could guide me or give me some pieces of advice within this writing about architecture field, I couldn't find that many people to ask. And the ones I asked were more like, yeah, we can help you, but can you please help us because we need this and that article to be written, or can you make some proofreading, or can you join this project where we need to, I don't know, communicate something about. So, I mean, it kind of formed itself, actually, because I had this interest and I obviously looked for opportunities, and then the opportunities kind of came to me, and I really haven't looked back since. If I'm to add something, I mean, that was my biggest difficulty about choosing writing about architecture over architecture, that I felt that I wasn't a real architect because I've never specialized in designing and drawing, right? But I've been spending all the years now trying to prove that even though you're not a design architect, that you can still be an architect some way or another.
You also mentioned that there was not a writing environment in architecture, especially it wasn't big. So you kind of created your own environment and your own opportunities. I think that this is just a very smart way of doing things. I can just relate with my podcast that I was really looking for a nice urbanism podcast, ideally bilingual in my native language and in English, but I couldn't find one. So I just created my own. So I just kind of created this niche for myself. And I think that this is just a very smart way of using your skills. But coming back to one more thing, you said that your service, your skills were in high demand. There were not many people into a PR side of architecture, into communications, into business development. Why was it like this? And do you have any ideas why there were not many people interested in this part of architecture, which I hope that people are now aware is extremely crucial?
Yeah, I mean, so I also did my thesis about this, writing about architecture and the role of communication in architecture, right? And back then, it's almost 10 years ago now, but back then, what I saw was that during the past 10 years, so now we're talking like back in the early 2000s, right? It wasn't, maybe the architecture firms didn't have to communicate a lot. I mean, I think it's a part of a huge, like this development in society in general, that everything has been more globalized, everything has been more professionalized. Running a business is something completely different, especially running an architectural business is some super different from like maybe 30 or 40 or 50 years ago, where you could just sketch on a napkin, win the competition, build the building, and then everyone would know that you did this. I mean, the world is just so much bigger now, right? So I came in to this field at a time where things were starting to cook. I mean, Big had been like in the scene for some years. The companies that came after him, like Kobe and Effect and JAJA and like all this wave of like young Danish architecture firms came in with a total different way of communicating architecture as well, right? But when I did my internship as a communications assistant at Henning Larsen, we were not yet on Facebook. I mean, we were not on social media at all. And everything was centered around the website, basically. And even though it was one of Denmark's largest architecture companies, right, it was still something to be developed and to be put in the center of running the business together with like developing a more professional and globalized organization.
It's hard to imagine nowadays that there are big star architecture offices that are not having their own social media, right? Because this is like often their main inflows of people, of clients.
Right. Unless you choose not to. That can be a statement too, right?
So to make it in this more old school way, would you say that there was this world of architecture before and after internet? So that before you, as you mentioned, you could sketch on a napkin and just have a nice pitch and charismatic presentation. I think that it really allowed for a big creativity. Whereas now you kind of have this typical way of just having your Instagram account, Facebook account, LinkedIn account, and you just post as much as you can.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think that's true, but I don't think it doesn't just apply to architecture, right? It applies to every industry because it's just how the world developed, how the world evolved, like with globalization, rapid communications. I mean, it's just another ballgame now. So, I mean, yeah, if you want to, I don't know, you kind of, you made me think if it makes architecture, like if architecture were better in the old days where you didn't have to communicate like this. And I don't necessarily think that because I mean, all the technological development, the communication, like the development in communications, like all these different industries or fields of professional fields that influence architecture, right? And I think that all in all, it makes everything better. It adds to the value of what we do as architects, right? But obviously, it's a balance. And we see these big discussions right now with like, for instance, how you create a render and make everything look kind of supernatural. Maybe it looks a bit too good to be true. And maybe it is, right? So it's kind of a balance to not like to communicate, but communicate in an honest way and not be like just communicating architecture and not actually making good architecture. Does that make sense?
Yes, I mean, exactly. I think that was my point, that I was just wondering, don't we as architecture industry focus too much on the final image, right? Don't we just overdo the makeup instead of focusing on how to skillfully get your message through?
But I also feel that we're at a point right now where there's this kind of paradigm shift that maybe it was like this 5 years ago.
Okay.
Maybe even not too long ago, but now I experience some kind of movement towards something else, right? Towards something that's more honest, more true, more comparison or opposite, like the more superficial, maybe just looking at the images, blah, blah, blah. Because you can also make good communication around more honest architecture. You just need to communicate it a bit differently. But it's still important to communicate. You just need to choose a different approach to your communication, I think.
It reminds me of this conversation that I had with Ippolita Nicotera, business development manager from Topotec One, a Berlin-based architecture office. And she also said that over the years, we learned that we maybe should put the people, the human, on the render as well. So I think that there was this development also of consciousness. Oh, yeah, that's right. That's a good idea to actually put the user on the image. So that's why I was just wondering about this role of media and graphics, images, and so on. You also been the press officer at Henning Larsen here in Copenhagen. Could you share some experience from this role? Because as we said in the beginning, your current role where you're at right now, it requires different skills, different experience that you gathered. So let's maybe talk about this more press officer role.
Sure. It actually, it's kind of a continuation of what I just said before, like picking up on like, how do you communicate architecture? And it doesn't really matter if it's what is your values and your belief in terms of how you create architecture, but communicating in an interesting way. And what I learned when I was in this press officer role at Henning Larsen, where I was for like 5 or 6 years, is that you can always find, I mean, you should look for the good stories and find the good stories. And obviously, it takes a little knowledge or at least a little experience to know what a journalist would think of is a good story, right? Because we, like many other professions, I think architects also tend to think that their little detail that they have been working on for 3 weeks in a row, like, you know, it's most important because we made these wooden joints or something. It's just, but maybe that's not exactly what like the journalist at Politiken or Frame magazine or wherever you want to be published thinks is super important. So you need to look for the good stories. What I learned is that you can actually do that. I mean, even though you would think that architecture is the only good story is when the building is done and you can go check it out yourself and it maybe makes a difference in your everyday life or makes a difference for a lot of school children or patients, whatever, depending on the type of building. But you can also find all of these good stories like on the way to getting to the result. And you need to do that because architecture is a slow industry, right? It takes a long time for the projects to come to life. And if you want to create communication and add value to the projects through communication, you need to do it through the entire lifespan of the project until it's actually finished. And what I think we could have done better maybe was also to continue looking for the good stories then after the building is handed over to the users and it opens. And I think we could still be better at like going back, visiting the places we did to see if they are working as we wanted them to, if all our intentions has now come to life or if it's something different. And we did some examples with like, for instance, the Moskov Museum, we did like this follow-up with video interviews and articles and all kinds of different media we used. And it just added even more value to the project to be able to document and show the world that it was actually being used the way we wanted it to be. And also in ways we didn't expect it to be, right?
This kind positive surprise is always
right.
just making you happy that you didn't even think about a way that the building can be used, and suddenly it's just becoming very popular because of this certain use. To follow up in this episode with Ippolita Nicotera, we've been also talking about the second life of the project, right? So what happens after you hand in a competition or a project or some documentation, that it's not that the project, it's done. It's just the new life of the project that starts with being built, with people using it, with also documenting and photographing people using this space. It gives this another level of success to a project.
And it is actually the most important or the longest life of the building, right? Because the project, maybe if it's like a super complex building, the project may be underway for, 5 years. But hopefully the building will stand for, 50, 100 years maybe. So it's like we focus on a very small part of the life cycle of the building, right? And we could definitely be better at focusing on the afterlife, looking from the architect's perspective, right?
And of course, this life cycle of a building, or especially the whole process of designing, building, and then maintaining the building, it might differ in time, right? It might be maybe 5 years, maybe 10 years, but you are still able to see the end result. It's way harder in bigger scale projects like urbanism, master planning, and so on. I'm curious, when you were the press officer and you've been communicating different projects outside, I assume you've been working with both scales. How did the communication differ depending on the scale of the project?
So maybe it's a different kind of communication when we're talking about urban development projects, because, rule number 1 in journalism and communication is to always make sure that you know your audience, right? Maybe the audience is different when you communicate about urban development projects, because you have to create a narrative that resonates maybe even more with like a huge group of users and like a very diverse group of users, compared to when communicating about, for instance, a school. Then you have some much more precise kind of target groups that that you should kind of direct your communication towards. So, I mean, a lot of the communication that we in our business is also communicating to collaborators. We communicate to future potential clients. I mean, it's a lot of communication within the industry, where with the urban development projects, at least if you do good, I think, then you should be able to communicate to a much broader audience. And you could do it as well with your building, like with your building projects. But it just seems to be, for some reason, that is still kind of limited to, the reviews. After the building's being done, then you can, if you're lucky, you can have a review in one of the large newspapers or in one of the huge like digital media, or maybe a presentation of the project. But we don't communicate a lot about the value of architecture to a broader audience, I think. That's also something that has been on the agenda, I know, in like the Danish Architects Association and like the Danish Association of the Architecture Firms, Danske Ark. I don't know what it's called in English anyway. But, they have tried to raise the flag and be like, if you as an industry were better at communicating to a broader audience, what is the value you actually create with the architecture? Like, we increase health, we increase like learning conditions. There are so many side effects or effects, maybe just like, it's not just like a physical building and something you look at. It really has a huge impact on people's lives and on their well-being. And if we were able to communicate that, that would be of interest to like everyone. But somehow we keep communicating a lot within our own little silo.
I think that there are also many decisions to be made, because you mentioned promoting the project after it's being done. And I assume it's also some cost, right? Because you devote your energy and your focus to promoting something that it's just already built, maybe, instead of focusing on the new projects. And it's the same with communication, right? Here in Copenhagen, we have many different architecture offices, and the biggest ones, but not only, communicate in English. but of course, preserving some part of communication in Danish. And this is also a decision to be made, right? There are also different decisions regarding the collaborators and the clients, how to approach clients. I just had an interesting discussion with my girlfriend yesterday, who is a landscape architect. And we've been discussing, there is a client who is, for example, wishing to build a tower. And you know that tower, and you as an architect, you approach the project, you see the site, and you think that, oh, actually, I don't think that tower will be a good idea in here. So what do? Do you go for the tower to maximize your chance of winning a project? Or you do something opposite to show that tower is the worst idea?
So I hope that we would do the opposite and try to convince the client that the tower was a really bad idea. At least that's kind of our philosophy here at JAJA, right? That it's a very important value to us that we do something that we can look ourselves in the mirror and be like, we believe in this. This is going to be a good project in terms of both architecture, but also in terms of sustainability and the impact on like social, environmental, economical factors. So I really hope, and now I'm saying this like on an open mic, so now we have to stick to that plan to, I think it's our role as architects it's our duty actually to convince people who are about to do something that's super stupid to not do it, right? But you're right. It is a decision to be made, and it's also a priority. We also need to prioritize how we use our resources. And that is another thing where I think at least the companies I've been working with are still struggling a bit to figure out the exact value of good communications or all these surrounding professions, because I'm not in doubt, like in my gut, in my heart, I know that if we went out to visit a building after, say, 5 years, we would find super valuable stories that could get published and have like great exposure through those stories. But even though I know that, I sometimes, everyday life just gets in on you and you forget that this is actually something that you need to do and that you need to prioritize. That is also why it's a full-time job to do the PR and public relations stuff in every business, I guess.
No matter how small or how big is the office, right? The workload always will be there.
Right, exactly.
We mentioned already acquiring projects, and here I would love to shift to business development. And the reason also why I wanted to talk to you, I was really, really interested in your part of the career where you've been working independently as a freelancer or a consultant. How did you find yourself transitioning from an office to being independent?
So that was actually tied to some very personal or private things that happened in my life, because I had my first daughter. And when I came back after maternity leave to the office, I just found myself being a whole different person with like new values and other things that I wanted to focus on in life, a career. But at the same time, I've always been super ambitious, right? So I was not ready to just give up my profession and everything I kind of believe in terms of architecture and running an architectural business. And so I just thought that maybe now was the time to become an independent again, because I'd actually had my own company while I was still studying too, and for the first years after graduating. So it wasn't that big a step also. Maybe that was also kind of a help that I knew that it was something that I could do, because it also takes a lot of skills other than writing and communicating and knowing things about architecture to run your own business, right? Even though you run it as a one-man band, or maybe especially because you run it as a one-man band, you also need to know how to figure out your budget, your economy, your invoicing, your taxes, all that stuff, right? Obviously, you also need to find jobs and clients that wants to work together with you. After like 6 years at Henning Larsen and a lot of good years at architecture school, I've always been networking a lot because it's just in my personality, not because someone told me to. So I had this huge network of people that I could just call up and be like, I'm considering to start my own business. Would you care for a coffee meeting? Maybe we can make something together. And then I never, so that's like the funny part, because I never in the very beginning, I had a couple of days where I made this super fast website and I never revisited it. It hasn't been edited at all during the 2.5 years I run my business because I didn't have to use it and I didn't communicate anything I did. It was just, word of mouth and people talking and calling me up, or me calling people up when I knew that maybe they had a need for someone like me.
I mean, you were in a lucky position to not be forced to use a lot of marketing and spend a lot of money on some paid ads. Or you didn't need to invest so much time, energy in marketing and getting the customers, which I think put you in a very lucky position.
Sure. I felt super privileged during those years also because I didn't, as you said, I didn't have to. It wasn't like a huge battle for me to like establish this company. But at the same time, I also had pretty low expectations, right? I wasn't expecting to earn the same money as I was used to. But at the same time, I was also not expecting to work as many hours. So for me, that was kind of the best of both worlds, that I got to work a little less hours and do what I love to do the most, right? So it was a super privileged situation. And then it also obviously was something that led to me now working here as the CEO, right? Because I had a good collaboration with the JAJA for several collaborations over that course of time. And also I gained a lot of experience with running my own business that kind of put me in a position where I was ready to take on the responsibility of running something a little bigger.
If I may, I have a two-in-one question. I wanted to ask, what were your main duties, your tasks, the things you've been doing on the daily basis as working independently? How did it differ from working in a team before? And the second thing is, what was the one thing that you learned the most during this period of independent freelance work?
What you learn when you start to work as an independent consultant is that you get rid of all these little things that people come ask you, can you help me do this and that? Or can you just create, the Christmas card for something? Or all those kinds of like everyday going on.
Small distractions.
Small distractions, but also important. It's not that it's not important tasks, but it's just, taking a lot of your focus from your actual job, if that was to do, like PR, active strategic PR and communications, right? So I did a lot of the same things, but I did that very focused, like working on a project, say, we have this project finishing up. We want you to make a press strategy. We want you to make a press plan for like publishing the thing all over, write the press release, what's in, the entire package of like promoting a recently built structure. So that was like one thing. Then I helped different companies with like more strategic work in terms of PR and communications. I did these kind of collaborations where I worked with the same company for 3 months or 5 months for a couple of days a week. And I sort of went in as, some kind of detective, like looking at what they got and trying to figure out a plan for how to optimize this, if they needed maybe to hire a student assistant or hire someone full-time to focus on this, or try to point out like different directions for them to look into in future. Yeah, that was probably the most common tasks or jobs that I did. And then what I learned the most is that you have a lot of freedom when you work as an independent consultant. Of course, you have a huge responsibility, but you're only responsible of yourself. And that gives a huge freedom, I think, which to be totally honest, I love working in a big environment with lots of colleagues. But sometimes I miss that independence or that freedom to be like, if one day you were feeling more of going for a walk or going to a cafe to have a good coffee and read a nice book or something, then I could actually do that. Obviously not if I was on a deadline or if I had a client or something, but it was like, it's much more independent way of working and living. And that's something that's very much on my mind at the moment, actually. also how to kind of implement that feeling in this office. And I haven't found the way to do that yet. I haven't cracked the nut, but hopefully I will someday. Because I think we're moving towards a total different way of working, right? Where work is just a part of living and not like something that's not a part of living, as it is, it's kind of been in like, there's been this kind of work-life balance dogma for like the past years, like I don't know how many years, as if work and life is separate, two different things. I mean, it's not, you're one person, it's one life, should all work together, right? So that's very much on my mind right now, how to kind of bring the best things from my time working as an independent into a collaborative like this.
So this is one of the biggest maybe tasks or challenges for now in your work at JAJA. And we are reaching this moment when after this very inspiring experience that you shared with me and the listeners, I'm very thankful for that. And just to pick your brain a little bit more, what was the one thing once you started here, the role managing the whole professional practice of JAJA? What was the one thing that you wish you knew before you started?
That is a good question. Okay, that is a really good question. My immediate answer would be that I wish I knew that being a CEO of a kind of small company, I mean, we're 20 people here, so we're not like super, super small, but we're not big either, right? Means that you have multiple roles, from like being the janitor to being like in the spotlight for panel debates or something like this. Or, I mean, my everyday work is very unpredictable. I mean, if I get in one morning and a water pipe is broken, it's my problem, right? If I get in and some IT stuff is not working, it's also my problem. I mean, it's always my problem. Yeah, big and small, right? But that's also what's so super interesting and challenging and fun about it. So I'm really growing with this position too. I mean, I wish I knew everything. So the thing with this role is that I had literally, well, obviously I had a lot of skills and competencies that qualifies me to do this, but I haven't done it before, right? So I have no experience in being an actual CEO of a company other than my own, where it was only me. So, I mean, I still don't know how to do this. I'm just trying my best every day to gain more experience and, hopefully do a bit better every day, be a bit better.
So you've been CEO already of your own independent company. So it was kind of a role that you've been having before. I'm happy that I managed to surprise you a bit with this question. And just to flip it around and just to summarize it from the other angle, what were the experience, the things that you learned in your previous positions as a press officer, in communication, in business development, that you can successfully use nowadays?
What I learned from my previous experience and what I use every day here is that I have this super profound interest in all the things that surrounds like the designing and creation, like detailing of the architecture, right? So I think I know now, which I've always, I wouldn't say that I've struggled, but it's always been a challenge for me to convince management elsewhere that they needed to also focus and spend money and resources on like other things than just making good architecture, right? So I think that is my biggest strength, that this is something that lies very deep in me. And then this interest in trying to maybe do things a bit differently than what I've been used to before. So trying to make a more modern workplace where we do things, maybe differently, maybe not. If it turns out that it's not a good idea, we'll change it back.
I think it's very good to experiment. That's how we learn, right?
Yeah.
To end on this learning note, again, I wanted to ask about a book recommendation.
I know.
Maybe you have one.
I do.
Ideally, it could be something close to the topic of our discussion.
It is somehow related to the topic, but it's also a bit controversial because I'm going to recommend a book that I didn't read yet. But I was joining this webinar not too long ago where they talked about this book as a place to start if you're interested in this topic. And this is something that is very much on my mind right now. So that's why I thought that I would recommend this book and maybe have you guys read it at the same time as I will, and we can have discussions how to implement this in our everyday life. The book I want to recommend is book called The 4-Day Week by a guy named Andrew Barnes. And it's basically a book describing work revolution where we work a little less than we do today, but optimize in a way so that we still maintain the same level of value creation. And I think that is something that's very interesting and inspiring, and something that I really want to learn more about and see if we can somehow implement at JAJA and hopefully in the rest of society too. I think we are going towards a work revolution where we will do things differently, and I hope to be a front runner within that. So yeah, a bit, maybe a bit controversial, maybe a bit off topic, I don't know, but that's my book recommendation.
That's lovely. You managed to make a revenge and surprise me as well.
Yeah.
As I was expecting something more architecture related, but I think that this is a thing of...
This is super architecture related too.
That's true.
That's the whole point.
That's true. That's my point, that I also read a lot of business development or business books in general. I think that it helps a lot to structure your own work and especially your life as well. So that's a very good recommendation, and thank you for that.
Sure.
Josefine, thank you very much for this conversation. I really think that you shared enormous amount of experience and advice if it comes to how to structure your work in communication, in PR, and also a bit in business development as well. And most importantly, from my perspective at least, that you shared this perspective on working independently, having this freedom of choosing who do you want to work with and what do you want to do. I think that was the great thing.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for listening to the newest conversation with Josefine. And I hope that you learned a lot from this conversation, because I think that it was a very interesting piece of knowledge, especially while Josefine was developing her career first as a journalist, writing about architecture, then communicating architecture, and now being having this kind of holistic approach as a CEO of JAJA Architects. If you like this episode, I would be very, very happy if you share it with some friends, with someone who might be interested in that topic as well. And if you subscribe or follow my podcast on Spotify, YouTube, or Apple Podcasts. And remember that you can also always contact me via my email, my website, Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, or wherever you can find me. Thank you very much, and talk to you very soon. New episode in English will be released in 2 weeks.